Good evening. Tonight we examine what may become the defining resource conflict of the 21st century between two nations that have called themselves the closest allies in the world. The United States and Canada are locked in an escalating dispute that touches on trade, sovereignty, national pride, and something far more fundamental than any of those concerns: water. The fresh, clean, drinkable water that sustains human life. 40 million Americans depend on water that flows through systems shared with Canada. 40 million people in cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Buffalo, and dozens of smaller communities across 8 states wake up every morning and turn on their taps without giving a single thought to where that water comes from or who controls its flow. They shower, they brush their teeth, they make their coffee. They fill their children's glasses at breakfast. They assume, as Americans have assumed for generations, that the water will always be there. But the water that flows through their pipes does not originate solely within American borders. It comes from the Great Lakes, the largest system of fresh surface water on the planet. A system that straddles the international boundary between the United States and Canada. And recent weeks have seen that boundary transformed from a line of friendship into a line of confrontation. The current administration has taken an increasingly aggressive posture toward Canada. Tariffs have been imposed and threatened. Rhetoric about Canada becoming the 51st state has moved from fringe speculation to statements made from the highest levels of government. Trade negotiations that once proceeded with the understanding that both nations shared fundamental interests have taken on an adversarial character that diplomats on both sides describe as unprecedented in living memory, and Canada has begun to respond. Not with matching rhetoric, but with quiet reminders of leverage that most Americans have never considered. Canada controls the northern shores of 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. Canada controls the outflow of the Great Lakes system through the St. Lawrence River. Canada has legal rights under treaties more than a century old that give it equal say over how the waters of the boundary region are managed and used. The geography is unforgiving. The Great Lakes contain approximately 21% of all the surface fresh water on Earth. 6 quadrillion gallons of water sit in these 5 connected inland seas. Lake Superior alone, the largest by surface area, covers nearly 32,000 square miles and holds enough water to flood the entire landmass of North and South America to a depth of 1 foot. Lake Michigan stretches along for American states. Lake Huron is divided almost equally between Michigan and Ontario. Lake Erie touches 4 states and 1 Canadian province. Lake Ontario feeds the St. Lawrence River that carries Great Lakes water through Quebec to the Atlantic Ocean. The 5 lakes are not separate bodies of water, but a single interconnected system. Water enters Lake Superior primarily through precipitation and small tributary rivers. It flows out through the St. Mary's River, dropping through the locks at Sault Ste. Marie. Into Lake Huron. From Huron, it moves through the St. Clair River into Lake St. Clair, then through the Detroit River into Lake Erie. From the shallow waters of Erie, it plunges 170 feet over Niagara Falls into Lake Ontario. And from Ontario, it begins its final journey through the St. Lawrence Seaway to the sea. This system does not respect political boundaries. The international line runs through the St. Mary's River. It runs through Lake Huron. It runs through the St. Clair River and Lake St. Clair and the Detroit River. It runs through Lake Erie. It runs through the Niagara River and Lake Ontario. At every stage of the water's journey from the western tip of Lake Superior to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, it passes through shared jurisdiction, shared control, shared responsibility. The legal framework governing this shared water dates to 1909, when the United States and Great Britain signed the Boundary Waters Treaty. At that time, Canada was still a dominion of the British Empire, and its foreign affairs were conducted by London. The treaty established a fundamental principle that has governed cross-border water relations for 116 years. Neither nation would take any action that would affect the natural level or flow of boundary waters on the other side without the approval of both countries. The treaty created the International Joint Commission, a body with 3 American commissioners and 3 Canadian commissioners, to oversee disputes and make recommendations on cross-border water issues. For more than a century, this commission has worked quietly and effectively, resolving conflicts before they escalated, managing water levels during droughts and floods, coordinating pollution control efforts, and maintaining the principle that the Great Lakes belong to both nations equally. That principle is now being tested as it has never been tested before. The current tensions did not emerge from nowhere. They have roots in trade disputes that began during the first Trump administration and intensified dramatically during the second. Tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum were justified under national security provisions. That struck many observers as absurd given that Canada had been America's closest military ally for generations. Tariffs on Canadian dairy products, lumber, and automobiles followed. Each round of American tariffs brought Canadian counter-tariffs in response. But the escalation took a sharply different turn when the administration began speaking openly about Canadian sovereignty itself. Comments about Canada becoming the 51st state were initially dismissed as jokes or rhetorical flourishes. They are no longer being dismissed. The Canadian government has interpreted these statements as challenges to the fundamental legitimacy of their nation, and the response has hardened accordingly. Canadian officials have begun making pointed references to the resources they control that Americans depend upon. The St. Lawrence Seaway, jointly operated by both nations, carries shipping traffic that connects the Great Lakes industrial heartland to the Atlantic Ocean. The power plants at Niagara Falls and along the St. Lawrence generate electricity that flows to homes and factories on both sides of the border. The pipelines that carry Canadian oil and natural gas to American refineries and heating systems have suddenly become topics of discussion in Ottawa. And water. Always, in these discussions, water comes up. 40 million Americans depend on the Great Lakes for their drinking water. If relations between the two countries continue to deteriorate, what happens to the cooperative management of that water? What happens to the treaties and commissions and agreements that have kept the water flowing freely across the border for over a century? The legal situation is complex in ways that most Americans do not appreciate. The Great Lakes are governed not only by the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909, but also by the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, first signed in 1972 and updated several times since, which commits both nations to protecting the lakes from pollution and maintaining water quality standards. There is the Great Lakes Compact of 2008, an agreement among the 8 Great Lakes states and 2 Canadian provinces that restricts the diversion of water outside the Great Lakes Basin. There are dozens of other bilateral agreements, joint commission rulings, and cooperative arrangements that together form a dense web of cross-border water governance. These agreements have worked because both nations wanted them to work. They have been enforced not primarily through legal mechanisms, but through the shared understanding that cooperation served both countries better than conflict. That shared understanding is now in doubt. Consider what Canada could do if it chose to exercise its leverage aggressively. The outflow of the Great Lakes is controlled by structures in the St. Lawrence River, many of which are on Canadian soil or under joint control. The International Joint Commission sets water levels for the lakes based on complex calculations involving precipitation, evaporation, and downstream needs. Canada has equal representation on this commission and could, in theory, deadlock decisions that the United States once made. The St. Lawrence Seaway, which allows ocean-going vessels to reach Great Lakes ports like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Duluth, is jointly operated. Canadian cooperation is not optional for the Seaway to function. The locks and channels on the Canadian side are essential to the system. If that cooperation were withdrawn or degraded, the economic consequences for the American Midwest would be measured in billions of dollars. The power-generating facilities at Niagara Falls and along the St. Lawrence produce electricity that serves both countries. The agreements governing how that power is shared and distributed rest on the same foundation of cross-border cooperation that is now being eroded. None of this means that Canada is threatening to cut off American water supplies. Canadian officials have been careful not to make explicit threats. They understand that such threats would escalate tensions further and might provoke responses that would harm Canada as much as the United States. The Canadian economy depends on trade with America. Canadian workers cross the border every day to jobs in American cities. Canadian businesses sell their products to American consumers. No responsible Canadian leader wants a genuine rupture in the relationship, but the reminders have been pointed. When American officials speak of Canada as a potential 51st state, Canadian officials speak of the resources that flow from Canadian territory to American consumers. When American tariffs target Canadian industries, Canadian commentators note that certain resources cannot easily be replaced from other sources. The message is clear without being explicit. This relationship has been mutually beneficial. If one side begins treating it as a zero-sum competition, the other side has cards to play as well. The residents of the Great Lakes region are watching these developments with growing alarm. These are communities that have never thought of Canada as a foreign country in any meaningful sense. The border between Detroit and Windsor, between Buffalo and Fort Erie, between Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, has been more like a boundary between neighboring states than a line between nations. People cross back and forth daily for work, for shopping, for family visits, for recreation. The idea that this border could become a site of genuine conflict seems almost unimaginable to those who have lived along it for generations. Yet the conflict is developing nonetheless. The rhetoric from Washington shows no signs of softening. The Canadian government, facing its own domestic political pressures, cannot be seen as backing down from what many Canadians perceive as American bullying. The tariff disputes continue. The trade negotiations remain stalled. And in the background, always in the background, sits the question of water. Climate change adds another layer of urgency to these concerns. The Great Lakes have experienced significant fluctuations in water levels in recent years, driven by changing precipitation patterns and increased evaporation during warmer summers. Lake Michigan and Lake Huron hit record low levels in 2013 before rebounding to record highs in 2020. These swings create challenges for shipping, shoreline property owners, municipal water intakes, and ecosystem health. Managing these challenges requires the kind of close binational coordination that current political tensions threaten to undermine. The International Joint Commission has been studying climate impacts on the Great Lakes for years. Their reports warn of increased variability, more intense storms, longer periods of ice-free water in winter, and potential long-term shifts in the hydrological cycle that could affect water availability for decades to come. Addressing these challenges will require cooperation. It will require shared data, shared models, shared planning, and shared investment. It will require exactly the kind of trust between neighbors that current events are rapidly eroding. The drinking water systems of Great Lakes cities were built on the assumption of abundant supply. Chicago draws its water from Lake Michigan through intake cribs located 2 miles offshore. Detroit takes its water from the Detroit River, the strait connecting Gaines Lake St. Clair to Lake Erie. Cleveland draws from Lake Erie, Buffalo draws from Lake Erie and the Niagara River. Milwaukee, Toledo, Rochester, Gary, Erie, Duluth, and dozens of smaller cities all depend on Great Lakes water for their municipal supplies. These systems cannot be easily converted to alternative sources. There are no other sources of comparable scale in the region. Groundwater in most Great Lakes areas is insufficient to supply major metropolitan areas. Building pipelines to bring water from distant rivers or aquifers would cost tens of billions of dollars and take decades to complete. The 40 million Americans who depend on Great Lakes water depend on it because there is no practical alternative. This dependency has never mattered much in the past because the water has never been seriously threatened. The lakes have always been there. The water has always flowed. The cooperation with Canada has always functioned smoothly enough that ordinary citizens never needed to think about it. But dependencies that do not matter in times of friendship can matter enormously in times of conflict. The legal experts who study transboundary water disputes point to troubling precedents from around the world. The conflicts over the Nile between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. The tensions over the Tigris and Euphrates between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. The disputes over the Indus between India and Pakistan. The fights over the Colorado River between the United States and Mexico. In each case, water that once flowed freely has become a source of strategic leverage, diplomatic conflict, and in some cases, military tension. The Great Lakes situation differs from these examples in important ways. The United States and Canada are both wealthy, stable democracies with long histories of peaceful cooperation. Neither country faces the water scarcity that drives conflicts in arid regions. The institutions governing Great Lakes water are well established and have functioned effectively for over a century. By any historical standard, this should be one of the easiest transboundary water relationships in the world to manage. But the current moment is testing assumptions that have held for generations. The assumption that the United States and Canada would always see themselves as partners rather than adversaries. The assumption that trade disputes would be resolved through negotiation rather than escalation. The assumption that shared resources would be managed cooperatively because cooperation was in both nations' interests. The assumption that the border between the two countries would remain, as it has been called for decades, the longest undefended border in the world. If these assumptions fail, the consequences will be felt most acutely in the communities that depend on Great Lakes water. Not immediately, perhaps. The legal frameworks that protect cross-border water cooperation have built-in resilience. Treaties cannot be abrogated overnight. Commissions continue to function even when political relations are strained. The physical infrastructure of water management does not disappear because politicians exchange harsh words. But over time, sustained political conflict would corrode the institutions that manage the lakes. Commissioners who cannot agree would fail to make necessary decisions about water levels and flows. Environmental protection efforts that require binational coordination would stall. Investment in shared infrastructure would be delayed or canceled. The dense web of cooperation that has kept the Great Lakes healthy and their water flowing freely would begin to fray. The business community on both sides of the border has begun sounding alarms. The Great Lakes region is home to significant industrial capacity that depends not only on Great Lakes water but on the cross-border supply chains and trade relationships that tariffs and political tensions are disrupting. Automobile manufacturing in Michigan depends on parts that cross the border. Multiple times before a finished vehicle rolls off the assembly line, steel production in Indiana and Ohio uses iron ore that comes through Canadian ports on Lake Superior. Food processing operations throughout the region depend on Canadian agricultural products and Canadian markets for their own exports. These economic interdependencies have developed over decades of open borders and cooperative trade policies. They cannot be unwound quickly without enormous disruption. And they cannot function efficiently in an environment of mutual suspicion and retaliatory tariffs. The business leaders who have built their operations on cross-border integration are pleading for a return to the cooperative relationship that made their success possible. But politics has its own logic. The administration in Washington has made clear that it views the trade deficit with Canada as a problem to be solved through tough negotiation. It has signaled that it considers Canadian sovereignty itself to be negotiable, at least rhetorically. And it has shown little inclination to moderate its approach in response to concerns from business groups, diplomats, or the residents of border communities who would bear the costs of a rupture most directly. The Canadian government, for its part, faces domestic pressures that limit its flexibility. The statements from Washington about Canada becoming a 51st state have been received in Canada as profound insults to national dignity. Any Canadian leader who appeared to capitulate to American pressure in the wake of such statements would face severe political consequences at home. The path toward de-escalation requires someone to climb down, and neither side currently sees climbing down as politically viable. This leaves the 40 million Americans who depend on Canadian-influenced water in an uncomfortable position. Their water supply is not in immediate danger. No one is suggesting that Canada would actually try to cut off American access to the Great Lakes. The physical infrastructure, the legal treaties, and the basic principles of international relations all protect against such an extreme outcome. But the cooperative framework that has managed the Great Lakes effectively for over a century is under strain as it has never been before. The institutions that coordinate water levels, monitor water quality, protect against pollution, and plan for climate change impacts are functioning in an environment of political hostility rather than political friendship. The long-term consequences of this shift may not be apparent for years or decades, but they are real. Water security experts urge both governments to separate water management from broader political disputes. They argue that the Great Lakes are too important to too many people on both sides of the border to become bargaining chips in trade negotiations or pawns in rhetorical games about sovereignty. They point to examples from around the world where hostile nations have nonetheless maintained cooperative water management because the alternative was too dangerous to contemplate. Whether this advice will be heeded remains to be seen. The current trajectory of United States-Canada relations does not suggest rapid de-escalation. The tariff disputes continue. The provocative rhetoric continues. The mutual trust that once characterized the relationship continues to erode, and the water continues to flow. From Lake Superior through the St. Mary's River to Lake Huron, from Huron through the St. Clair River and the Detroit River to Lake Erie, from Erie over Niagara Falls to Lake Ontario, from Ontario through the St. Lawrence to the sea. 6 quadrillion gallons of fresh water, 21% of all the surface fresh water on Earth, flowing through a system that belongs to two nations whose relationship is changing in ways that no one fully understands. The 40 million Americans who drink this water, who bathe in it, who wash their clothes in it, who cook with it, who depend on it for their lives, may never think about where it comes from or who controls its flow. They may never consider the treaties and commissions and agreements that govern its use. They may never worry about the political disputes that could, in a worst-case scenario, disrupt access they have always taken for granted. But someone should be thinking about these things. Someone should be working to ensure that political conflicts do not endanger the most fundamental resource that humans require for survival. Someone should be protecting the cooperative framework that has kept the water flowing freely for over a century. Tonight, it is not clear that anyone is. That is our report. The dispute between the United States and Canada over trade, sovereignty, and resources continues to develop. The Great Lakes, shared by both nations, remain central to the lives of 40 million Americans who may not realize how much they depend on cross-border cooperation that current events are putting at risk. We will continue to follow this story in the days and weeks ahead. Thank you for watching. Good night.